Welcome back in. Welcome back in. So let's go ahead and talk about our top 12 running backs for week 11. They start off with Saquon Barkley, Austin Eckler, Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, Dalvin Cook, Nick Chubb, Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara, Josh Jacobs, Ramondre Stevenson, and Aaron Jones. So let's go ahead and talk about a running back that I want to talk about this week among this RB1 group, and that is Jonathan Taylor. Hey, welcome back to fantasy relevance. This past week against the Raiders, he went off for 163 yards and a score, which is good for 24.3 PPR points. He played 95% of the snaps. He had 22 carries. And he had 2 targets in that game. He also ran a route on 75% of dropbacks. So those are all very encouraging signs. This offensive line played much better than what we've seen in weeks past. It looks like maybe this changed to Jeff Saturday, put a little bit more life into this offense. And hopefully it's a sign of things to come. Also installing Matt Ryan back there, I think, is also going to help things. But this week, they do get a pretty good matchup against the Eagles. If the Eagles struggle anywhere on defense, it's definitely against the run. They rank 28th in rush DVOA. They'll have the 12th most PPR points to running backs. They've also allowed the 15th most rushing yards and the 9th most rushing touchdowns on the season. So this is a very good matchup for Jonathan Taylor this week. So let's go ahead and jump over to our RB2s this week. And we have Dameon Pierce, Miles Sanders, Jamal Williams, Tony Pollard, Isaiah Pacheco has entered the chat, Deonta Foreman, Devin Singletary, Cordell Patterson, James Conner, David Montgomery, Antonio Gibson, and DeAndre Swift. Let's go ahead and jump into some of these RB2s. First guy I want to talk about is Dameon Pierce. While we have him ranked RB13, I actually have him at RB15 this week. I'm a little bit lower on him than consensus, and that's because this isn't a great matchup for him this week. While he is seeing 73.6% of the opportunities from this backfield, he's averaging 18.3 carries, three targets per game, and he's 5th in red zone touches. He's also 9th in yards after contact per attempt and 3rd in missed tackles forced. So he's been really efficient. And that's what's really led to his production this year. But this week they play the Washington Commanders, 13th in fantasy points allowed. They've allowed the 13th fewest fantasy points allowed to running backs. They've also allowed the 13th fewest rushing yards, 5th fewest rushing touchdowns, and they are 2nd in rush DVOA. So this is not a very good matchup for Dameon Pierce this week. But when he's going to be seeing so many opportunities, it's hard to really pass on him. So I do think Dameon Pierce, somebody you're still going to be starting this week, but I would just lower my expectations because this is a very good run defense here for Washington. So let's keep it moving here. Let's talk about Tony Pollard. Love to see if Ezekiel Elliott's going to be back this week. He has now missed 2 weeks in a row. It's the first time in his career that's ever happened. But Tony Pollard has played very well in his absence. Really, if you look at it on the season, he's handled 49% of the opportunities. He's averaged about 11.4 and 2.8 targets per game. 621 rushing yards, 134 receiving yards, 6 touchdowns, and in 14.7 fantasy points per game, which is 17th among all running backs. He's been highly efficient, like we always know. He has 6th in breakaway run rate, 1st in yards after contact per attempt, and 16th in missed tackles forced. This matchup this week, they take on the Minnesota Vikings. This is kind of a middle of the road matchup against running backs for them. They rank 14th in rush DVOA, but they have allowed the 5th fewest fantasy points to running backs. We have seen with Tony Pollard 3 straight games over 100 total yards, and he's been a top 8 running back in each of the last 2 weeks. Now, again, Ezekiel Elliott is going to play a factor here, but we have to remember Tony Pollard, really outside of last week where he had 22 carries, isn't really a running back that really needs that kind of production. It's not like with Ezekiel Elliott coming back, it's really going to be some huge negative. I think really where it hurts him the most is inside the goal line because you know they're going to put Ezekiel Elliott back there if that happens. We'll have to see if he's going to be back this week, but whether he does, whether he doesn't, I still think Tony Pollard is an absolutely great start every single week for the rest of the season. He's going to be involved. He's going to see 10 to 15 touches per game, and that's going to make him very fantasy viable, especially as efficient that he is. So you can fire up Tony Pollard with confidence, with or without Zeke. Let's keep moving here. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, and that's Isaiah Pacheco. Are we overreacting to 1 week? I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see on that, and it is possible. But I do think that he is somebody that we should be looking to start. This is a great matchup against a terrible run defense. Last week, Isaiah Pacheco played 58% of the snaps, 16 carries. He did run a route on 45% of Patrick Mahomes' dropbacks. He also had 82 yards and 2 red zone carries in that game. He did not find the end zone there, and that's always going to be the problem with any Chiefs running back. It's going to be hard to predict on a weekly basis how much opportunity there's going to be for running backs because, the Chiefs throw the ball so much inside the goal line. And so, but this is a terrific matchup. The Chargers ranked 29th in rush DVOA. They've allowed the 3rd most rushing yards, the 5th most rushing touchdowns. They've allowed 25.1 PPR points per game to running backs. So this is a very good matchup. The only issue here is game script. If the Chiefs were allowed themselves to get this game get away from them, that's where Jerick McKinnon comes in. He was actually I was going to talk about in the RB3s, but I want to talk about him right now. Now, last week he only played 31% of the snaps, but the week before that, in a much more closer contested game, especially early on against the Titans, he played 64% of the snaps. He's seen 8 targets in each of his last 2 games as well. 6 catches, 58 yards last week. He has back-to-back double-digit fantasy points. So I also think that he's also going to be an option here moving forward. Clyde Edwards-Helaire did not play at all, played 4 snaps last week, and I don't know if that's really going to change. Clyde Edwards-Helaire has pretty much been a bust. He was a first-round pick a few years ago, and he's really done nothing with those opportunities. The Chiefs appear to be done with him. The few opportunities that he got last week, he came in, saw 2 targets, and he dropped both of them. So surprise, surprise. So I do think Isaiah Pacheco is a decent flex option this week. We have him ranked as a top 18 option, and I think you can be pretty confident in him this week. The only way that I think that he wouldn't see as many opportunities if the Chiefs were to fall behind here. The Chargers could be getting back Mike Williams and Keenan Allen this week. Both are expected to practice. I would feel better about Mike Williams than I do Keenan Allen at this point. But if both of them are back at home, it's possible they get in a lead, and then you see much more Jerick McKinnon than you would Isaiah Pacheco. But that being said, I still think, even though there's some risk behind it, trusting any running back behind Kansas City, Isaiah Pacheco, I still think is a pretty decent option this week as a flex. And don't forget about Jerick McKinnon either. So let's keep it moving here. And another one committee to another. That's Cordell Patterson against Chicago. This one's hard to trust, right? Because he's not seeing the same usage that he was earlier in the season since he's come back from this injury. On the season, he's averaging 12.7 carries per game, 1.5 targets per game, which is kind of weird as good as a pass catcher that he is. They're just not utilizing him at all as a pass catcher out of the backfield. But it's also Marcus Mariota. They just don't really want him to throw the ball, so they are running a ton. He has 402 rushing yards, 39 receiving yards on the year, but his 5 touchdowns is saving his bacon. He's averaging 13.4 fantasy points per game, but the last 2 weeks since he's come back from injury, he's only seeing 9 carries per game. He's played 38% of the snaps. You compare that to Tyler Algier, who's playing 45% of the snaps and seeing about roughly the same in terms of carries, 9 carries, and 27% route participation, which is higher than Cordell Patterson. But the matchup is fantastic. The Bears are 26th in rush DVOA. They're the 4th most fantasy points to running backs, 5th most rushing yards, and the 2nd most rushing touchdowns. That's why I think Cordell Patterson and Tyler Algier are both options this week as flex options. I don't have high expectations because it's going to be hard to trust on a weekly basis which one of these guys is going to see is going to see the end zone or have an opportunity at the end zone. But I think just with this matchup alone, I think this is another pretty decent spot here, and I think you can play both of these guys, not with a high level of confidence, but with some confidence anyway. So let's keep it moving and talk about Devin Singletary. They get Cleveland this week. Devin Singletary is handling 63% of the opportunities, 10.2 carries per game, 4.2 targets per game, 21 red zone touches, and he has almost 600 total yards and 3 touchdowns. He's averaging 11.3 fantasy points per game. They are 5th in routes run. He is 5th in total routes run. He's also 30th in yards per route run and 35th in yards created per touch. Last week, he saw 48 total yards, 2 touchdowns, and 15.7 fantasy points. Now, that was in a little bit tougher matchup against the Vikings. This week, not the case. They can take on the Cleveland Browns, who are 32nd in rush DVOA. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs, 6th most rushing yards, and the 4th most touchdowns. Great matchup here for Devin Singletary. For somebody that's playing roughly about 70% of the snaps every single week. Obviously, Josh Allen is always going to limit his ceiling because of his ability to run the football as well and his ability to see goal line opportunities. But with Josh Allen a little banged up, you might see a little bit more Devin Singletary than you typically would from Josh Allen. But regardless of that, still a great matchup. Still a decent middle-of-the-road RB2 this week against Cleveland. Lastly, let's talk about Brian Robinson and Antonio Gibson. Another committee that's in a great spot this week against a really, really bad run defense. However, Brian Robinson has just not been very good. I know he's coming off his best game of the year where he had 26 carries. He played 51% of the snaps, 86 yards, and 1 touchdown. But efficiency-wise, that's horrendous. 26 carries for only 86 yards is awful. He's lucky he found the end zone, which got him 14.6 fantasy points last week. On the season, he's getting about 50% of the opportunities, seeing about 15.5 carries, 0.7 targets. So he's an absolute non-factor as in the passing game. Only 7 receiving yards on the year. 305 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns. He's averaging 7.9 fantasy points per game. He's been truly dreadful with 52nd in yards created per touch and 47th in breakaway run rate. You compare that to Antonio Gibson, who's playing about 46% of the opportunities, 10.3 carries, 4.1 targets, 22 red zone touches, And on the season, he has 372 rushing yards, 253 receiving yards, which is the sixth most among all running backs, 5 touchdowns, and 12.7 fantasy points per game. He's been the better running back in this backfield. He's also fifth in yards per route run. He's been really good as a pass catcher out of the backfield. Both these guys are viable against the defense that ranks 31st in rush DVOA. They are allowed the most rushing yards, the most rushing touchdowns, and over the last 3 games, they've allowed 218 rushing yards per game on the ground. This isn't a game script type of game where you're worried about it getting away from them. Brian Robinson, I think, is a decent option. He's not very efficient, but if he can't get it going against this team, I don't know what team he's ever going to be able to get it going against, because this team is terrible against the run. So Brian Robinson and Antonio Gibson are borderline RB2s or borderline RB2/flex options this week against a really bad team. So let's wrap this up and talk about a few more guys so we can get out of here. I want to hit on Elijah Mitchell this week, who returned last week, played 36% of the snaps. He had 18 carries for 88 yards, 1 reception on 2 targets for 9.8 fantasy points. Didn't get any opportunities to score a touchdown. But CMC on the other side of that played 63% of the snaps, 14 carries, but he ran 21 routes, 6 targets, 77 yards, and a score for 17.7. There's been a little bit of concern this week about Christian McCaffrey because of Elijah Mitchell's usage. He actually outcarried him, but I'm not all that concerned with it. Arizona allows the 11th most fantasy points to running backs this week. They allow the 18th most rushing yards, but the 9th most rushing touchdowns, and they're 16th in rush DVOA. I think this is a pretty decent matchup for them. I think honestly with CMC, they're not a team that's going to want to utilize him 90% of the 90% of the snaps and really bury him into the ground. They have obviously playoff aspirations, and so I don't think it's a bad thing that Christian McCaffrey is not seeing the 85-90% of the opportunities that we're used to seeing from him. Elijah Mitchell is definitely going to mix in here, but I think on a week-to-week basis, it's going to be a little bit tough to trust. It's going to matter on game scripts, how the game's going, and situations like that. Elijah Mitchell is an excellent fit for Kyle Shanahan's scheme. So, anyways, Melvin Gordon, I really hate myself for this, but this is a good matchup against the Raiders. The Raiders allow the 7th most fantasy points to running backs, 4th most receiving yards as well, 6th most receptions, 3rd most receiving touchdowns to running backs, and they're 24th in rush DVOA. Last week, he played 55% of the snaps, 9 carries. He ran 22 routes, 4.6 targets, and 12.6 fantasy points per game over his last 2 games. So he's been utilized as a pass catcher. He's a decent option, much more of a flex option against a really bad, dysfunctional Raiders team right now. Don't mind Melvin Gordon if you're in a pinch. And then lastly, Kenyan Drake. Now, Kenyan Drake maybe should be higher, but it sounds like Gus Edwards should be back this week. Over his last 2 games, he's played 64% of the snaps. He's averaged 15.5 carries, 3 targets, 88 total yards, 1.5 touchdowns, and 20.8 fantasy points over those last 2 games. But with the emergence of Gus Edwards coming back, I still think Kenyan Drake is going to be the leader in this backfield, but he's probably going to eat into a little bit of this opportunity here. Obviously, with Lamar Jackson, it's going to change things, but it's a really good matchup. Carolina allows the 5th most fantasy points to running backs, 22nd in rush DVOA. If I had to make a decision, I trust Kenyan Drake more than Gus Edwards. Gus Edwards, coming back from that major injury last year, got hurt again. And, I just don't think they're going to be wanting to rush Gus Edwards back and put him right back in here and with a lot of touches. So I think Kenyan Drake is probably fine for at least another week in a really good matchup against Carolina. So that kind of wraps up, the running backs we want to talk about this week. I appreciate everybody checking out the video. If you have any questions, any lineup decisions, trades, whatever it is, leave it in the comment section below. We will get to it. We'll help you out. We're trying to get another win this week. We're only a few weeks away from the fantasy playoffs. We will catch you on the next one. Bye.